are giving different kinds of information according to their nationality. Because that's where you find somebody was sponsored by Kenya to go to UNEP. And so that's a person who's SMSing me and telling me, Balozi, wanasema hivi. Wanasema hivi. Then you think, now this guy, is he telling me the real thing? Or is this the secretariat going through a Kenyan because they know it'll be believable to the Kenyan delegation? And that was the same with the Germans. That was the same with the Brazilians. It doesn't matter. So you're balancing all the time. And in this room, we're negotiating. On the first night, we were there until 2 in the morning. And everyone was now completely exhausted because we're all stating the same arguments in different words. We were stuck. We were completely stuck. Mexico was cheering. Kenya, the Africa group, the United States, the Europeans, all had created distinct camps against one another because they wanted narrower governance options. And so Kenya had to keep reaching, what can we find to negotiate? What can we give them so that we get what's most precious to us? And what is most precious to us? Global universal governance, return of headquarter functions to Kenya. What can we do? So in came the banding about of the name of this organization. And because everyone is tired and everyone's fed up, you find yourself negotiating over something that's ultimately not that important, but it's where all your energy is. And you feel as if I back off on this, my whole position will crumble, including some of the things that I want to happen and some of the things we want to see. So what ultimately happened is we had the good fortune of bringing our ambassador from New York, who had negotiated Rio Plus 20, a very experienced diplomat called Ambassador Macharia Kamau, who has spent his whole professional life in the UN system. He knows it so well. And then we had young diplomats, many of them your age, and they were the ones negotiating the technical details. And they were extremely tough. I remember one young guy, I told him, aren't you exhausted? He told me, Balozi, nitakaa hapa mpaka hao waende nyumbani. And that's part of the reason is because there's a small little tactic that some delegations use, which is you drag out the negotiation. By the time you figure 1, 2, 3 in the morning, the other person just wants to go home. They're just thinking of their family, their sleep. They're no longer thinking of national interests. So they just give in. And what typically tends to happen is that the poorer countries with smaller delegations, as the night wears on, they start to go. And all that's left there is the big countries. Why is that? It's not because of laziness. It's because the stakes as you rise up the geopolitical ladder keep rising. If you're a small Pacific island, does it really matter that Europe won over you? Not really. You just take one of the big countries, adopt their position, and life goes on. But if you're Brazil, and you have very specific interests in agribusiness, in the field of environment, then you're not there to play around. You have very serious interests, and you have to protect them. And I'm proud to say that the Kenyan team, by the time we were leaving, the room was 2, 3 Europeans and about 10 Kenyans, all sitting there, completely determined to not leave. So ultimately, we didn't win the ability to call the organization the UN Environment Organization. It's now called the United Nations Environment Assembly for UNEP. Now you see, that for UNEP was a compromise. It was countries that wanted the power of this body to be rhetorically reduced. Because if you say the United Nations Environment Assembly, it sounds like the UN General Assembly, doesn't it? And yet it's supposed to be subsidiary to the General Assembly. And so they said, you have a universal assembly, but only of UNEP, right? And we agreed to it very quickly because the first thing we understood is, listen to this phrase, United Nations Environment Assembly of the United Nations Environment. No one will ever say it. So it may be written that way, but at the end, in the coming months and years, it'll only be known as the United Nations Environment Assembly. What is written doesn't matter. It's the political import that mattered to Kenya. It was the chance that because of that being a universal body that meets here every 2 years, oh, by the way, we wanted it to meet every year, but we had to concede that one because there were people who wanted it to meet every 4 years. We knew that, okay, now it's a universal membership. What does that mean? It means that there are some countries that will come and open new embassies in Nairobi so that they can be here to negotiate environmental issues. If they do that, that's jobs, that's prestige, that's us being a diplomatic center of diplomatic life on the continent and in the world. So it was very important for that universal option to push through away from a resolution in Rio to an actual working structure in the new dispensation. Then in terms of headquarter functions, we now knew here is where the real trick is. Rather than fight it, because we said it can't be fought because already the assembly in Rio had agreed on it, all we could discuss is the modalities and the way there. And how did we do that? That ultimately ended up being something you kick down the road because other negotiations were so exhausting, so taxing, and you were never going to win this one because all these other countries want these programs in their own country. Europe is nowadays much poorer than it used to be. It has been in a crisis. Europe wants more jobs, and the UN creates good jobs. So some of these issues, but also to host programs that define and can drive the global agenda, very important for many countries. So we said, you know what, there'll be consultants who will look into this, the secretariat will hire them, but we pushed it for something to be negotiated and looked at by the Committee of Permanent Representatives, which is what I sit on and is where a number of ambassadors here in town and abroad are accredited to UNEP. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, in a very illustrated and incomplete way, was some of the negotiations that happened during that time. What did I learn? One is that multilateral negotiation is highly complex as opposed to bilateral negotiation. You're perpetually in, and by complex, I mean something very, very particular. I don't mean complicated. Complicated is a watch. A watch is a really complicated thing, but ultimately it's all predictable. Complex is that every actor is in a dynamic shifting mode, and that their shifts are affecting other people's positions. So the Africa position keeps moving and bulging as it's subjected to the dynamics of other positions. The Africa position can be 15 minutes ago, the Egyptian ambassador may have told you this, but that was before his conversation with the American ambassador. And then suddenly, you find his negotiator saying something that you thought is not really where you are, but not really contradicting you that much, but in a subtle way driving you away from where you want to be. In other words, there is constant interaction of each other's positions. And that means holding a static or a linear view of the negotiation is impossible. So you're perpetually in alliances that are crumbling even as they're being built up. And then you're perpetually in debates that appear very fierce, but in the middle of the debate with this particular country or group of countries, you realize that there's a position where they can pivot closer towards you, or you can negotiate something and move to a third position, both of you. Both of you having lost something you wanted, but gained something together. So you could appear very fierce against each other, but you can find a third position. And that, my friends, is why you were being taught etiquette and protocol. Because no matter the heat of the moment. For instance, without giving a particular instance, the suspicion as an African that there's a country across from you that thinks you're inferior to them, that thinks that they're supposed to say what you should do, and you just tell them, yes, sir, just tell me how to do it, and I'll do it exactly as you want me to do it. To see that look in that person's eyes, or in that position, or in their body language, but you have to maintain your cool, your politeness. You cannot allow those kinds of things to interfere with how you represent your country. And so inside yourself, you need tools of behavior and comportment that have nothing to do with your feelings. And this now I'm describing an ideal situation because we're human beings, so people also react. But ultimately, those tools are invaluable. The relationships amongst diplomats and within networks within different countries are invaluable. Your relationship with the Norwegian deputy ambassador or deputy head of mission may be what allows you to take him or her aside and have them be able to give you some sense that there can be some negotiation, some agreement, because of the trust between the two of you. So when you're not at the negotiating table, you're perpetually working on your relationships. That's why I attend so many cocktail parties. That's why I constantly go to people to eat. I'm so sick and tired of it, but I have to do it. And people think I'm just wasting tax money, but it's not the case. We don't spend it recklessly, but it's an attempt to build the relationships that Kenya will require in its multilateral engagements. At the same time, in the multilateral sphere, you could be negotiating the environment, but in reality, you're negotiating about Iran's desire or lack of desire for a nuclear weapon. It is because global governance and geopolitical power is felt in many corners. So you may find Russia and America and Syria in some sort of argument over some little resolution, some little paragraph in a resolution on the environment, when in fact they're debating issues outside of that particular issue because they're trying to assert different parts of their primacy over and above each other. So that multilateral diplomacy and negotiation is a very broad table that has no limits. There's nothing like, oh, today we're just talking the environment. We're not talking trade. No. Everything is always in the room with you. The good relationship you got with Sri Lanka during a trade negotiation is invaluable when it comes to the environmental negotiation. So relationships, that's number 2 thing I learned in terms of feeling comportment. Then, and I'm coming to a close, is the issue of your own knowledge. It became clear to me that I needed an extremely nuanced and dynamic view of geopolitical alliances and histories. For instance, why does Colombia tend to take the opposite side of the floor as Brazil? I've been to Colombia, but I didn't know. But if you read history, there's some clues that you'll find. And so I found the need to keep understanding certain historical issues. I also realized the need to have a very good understanding of political geography. And in that way, there were many, many things that I've read in newspapers that were becoming unexpectedly useful. For instance, the relationship between the drought in northern Mexico and the spate of crime and violence in that region. It's not completely caused by that, it's drug trafficking, but there are issues there around climate and globalization, etc. Now, these are things that I've read in newspapers, and because I'm very curious and I read a lot of things, but ultimately, they were all being of some use in the negotiating table, not in a way that I could predict, but certainly in a way that meant that my whole life experience and what I read was coming to serve to be very, very useful. Finally, we came to the last day of the conference, where Kenya had gotten I would say our most critical aims, we had realized them. We hadn't gotten everything we wanted, but we got at least 50% of what we came for. And it was time now to close that particular conference. Except, my friends, with these multilateral negotiations, the negotiation never ends. So there are people who appear to surrender and just kick the debate down the road. They're like, nitakushika tukienda Vienna on this other issue, or Geneva. And so what has happened is countries like Kenya have a tremendously difficult time keeping up with the dynamic complexity of these negotiations. Because it means, if I'm sure you've learned this, the things you're trying to do is to represent, observe, report, and document. Those 4 principal tasks. And so the issue of documenting and having your documents available as you need them, when you need them, in different negotiations, if you start to imagine the numbers of them, they're extremely difficult to understand, to grasp. Do you see what I mean? Because you went for this trade thing at COMESA. Then you went for this other Indian Ocean Rim Association. And all these things ultimately have something to do with each other. But what we do is we have these enormous files. At the Kenya Mission, and if you ever visit me there, I'll take you to our filing room. It's boxes and boxes and boxes. And then when we're done filling it, we take it to a warehouse, a government warehouse, where now it's put inside there. Then once in a while I ask our secretary, could you get me this thing? She tells me, Balozi, now that one, you wait there first. But if I'm in Geneva and I need the things right there. So one of the great strengths that a lot of the richer countries had was their archiving and their documentation system. So you could see them with iPads and computers constantly downloading, constantly looking up different documents from different times in their databases. And this is a great advantage they had that we didn't have. And in that way, what many African countries and poorer countries end up doing is you end up arguing from your own personal intelligence and your own personal initiative. I tell you, it's a game you can't win for long. Yeah. And so we came to the final day of the conference, and now we've moved into the intersessional sense. In another 2 years, there's going to be another governing council. In that time, we will have tried to get some more movement on the movement of headquarter functions back to Nairobi. 2, we will have hopefully created facilities that allow different countries to come and open missions here in a more cost-effective way. And 3, we will have hopefully come up with a much harder, much more clear articulation of the Kenyan foreign policy interest than we have now, and the place of the environment in it, so that when we go into that negotiation, my intention is for us to be one of the strongest negotiating teams at that meeting, because one thing Kenya has is a tremendous group of young people at my mission, at the ministry, and elsewhere, who are truly a cut above many of their counterparts globally, in brackets, especially if their writing skills get stronger. And that, Daktari, has taken more than 15 minutes. But I'm sorry if I went on too long. Let me finish by really thanking you again and letting you know that the Kenya mission to the UN is a very open place. We don't have jobs to dish out, but we've got lots of friendliness to dish out. We've got advice to dish out. We like passionate people. Our doors are always open to them. And so I really envy your teachers the opportunity to spend quality time with you every day. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm sure now the students are looking forward to becoming like you. Now, I want to introduce you to the Associate Director of the Institute of Diplomacy and International Studies, Professor Gerson Ikiara, who will welcome you and probably thank you.
Yeah, maybe before I do that, I don't know whether we may give you a bit of chance. This was a great lecture, and I think we can give you some few moments if the ambassador has time. You can ask a few questions before I make some concluding remarks. But this was truly a great lecture, and therefore let's give a chance to you to interrogate that a bit. He has really gone very far into these issues and into the multilateral negotiations and with a particular case studies and with a particular context within the Kenyan context. So when we talk about national interest, you are able to see from a very specific example what that means. And when you talk about complexity of negotiations, you have some very clear dimensions of what that actually means and what it takes to be able to actually put that kind of objective into action and achieve your aims. So let me give you some chance to ask some questions, maybe 3 or so. If you make them fairly short, I think the ambassador will be able to answer.
Your Excellency, thank you for that very incisive. You actually carried us from the first moment to the very last. Personally, I was right there in all those meetings. Now, I just wanted to ask one thing. We didn't see much African representation recently in Qatar, Doha. That is the COP, Convention of Parties 18, held last year around October to November. We didn't see much of the African or Kenyan representation. I don't know why, because our continent is wrought with environmental problems, and I thought that was a continuation of Durban COP 17. I wonder why.
You can go ahead.
So today I'm representing Middle East ambassador, so we might have gotten some of your secrets, as you thought it was only Africans here today. But thank you so much for that descriptive picture you've given us of how negotiations go. And we hopefully will be joining you soon. My question basically is on how are you dealing with the challenge that you mentioned, especially when it comes to lack of e-archives where you can access information at your fingertips so that we are able to be at par with the more developed countries.
Much for the presentation. I'm really impressed, especially by your ability to capture all that and to give that presentation without really seeming to refer a lot. I think it reflects a lot of, there was quite a lot of reflection after the entire experience to capture all those lessons. And one key issue that has kept coming from your presentation is the appreciation of a resource that we may not really have appreciated before as a country, which is the human resource, because you kept referring to the group of young Kenyans who did quite some exemplary work. And what I wanted to know is, what did it take to prepare these people prior to this effort so as to achieve that kind of coordination, that kind of passion, and that kind of commitment? Yeah, thank you.
In addition to everything else that you've said, is that when the Kenyan team went for negotiations, they would finish as late as 3 a.m. And I think I can declare openly today that we could actually end that late because we have a negotiation to do. Anyway, back to my question. It's more on the practical side. How do you balance between serving national interests and conceding or giving in to some of the things that you wouldn't ordinarily let go in order to achieve the ultimate goal? For instance, with UNEP, you obviously, I would like to assume, had to let go or give in to some of the things that you wouldn't ordinarily give away.
To cover them to the level of detail or revelation that you need, these two gentlemen, that lady there, I'm sure they can answer this question. In fact, her question was quite rhetorical. She has a very clear answer to this issue, but I appreciate the question. One, our participation in COP18 in Qatar, I don't have a clear answer for you. in terms of an answer that really explains exactly what happened, why we were not represented as substantively as we should have been. But it's to tell you that there's been, over time, a proliferation of negotiations, right? So at any given time, like right now, I could be somewhere at a table with a microphone, right? There's a picture I took once with my mobile phone of one of these mics in the UN table, and I titled it "Weapon in the Foreground, Enemy in the Background," because I could see a hazy other figure, and this was the way to fight them.